Welcome to the Christadelphian video service. We now come to our second session in the series, The Woke World, our battle against spiritual wickedness in high places. In our previous session, we looked at the development of the woke world through the humanistic phase of the world in the last 40 or 50 years, then the postmodern world, and we came down to the woke world. And as we said in our last talk, woke is being alert to injustice in society, especially racism. It feeds on anger and resentment. It's being alive, awake to racial prejudice, discrimination, or any social injustice. And it's interpreted through the woke dogma and the critical theory and the woke language, as we're going to see in the sessions that are to come. So that's what woke is. And we are just following on now from the history we traced in the last talk to look at some of the methodology used by woke as we go through it. Remember the predictions we looked at? That in the last days there would be perilous times, there would be the despising of those that are good, seducers and evil men would wax worse and worse, men would turn from truth to fables, there would be agitation and strife amongst the nations, and there would be a spirit of insanity that would restructure the world in which we live just prior to Armageddon. And we saw those things were the basis of the events we expect to see happening in the world, and why we must be very much aware of the times in which we live. So here are the emerging battle tactics which are used by the woke promoters. There's a thing now called woke speak. Woke speak means being in touch with the latest acceptable terms. So you're across what you're expected to say, the words you're expected to use, the words you can no longer use, to know what the issues and causes are, and to be in sympathy with them. As we said in the last talk, it's no good anymore that you just can't say, well, look, you have your view, I'll have mine. Now you've got to be an ally. You have to be with them. So you've got to have woken up to how wrong the past ideas were. And you've got to be open then to be changed and to be molded by woke thinking. And it moves very fast. Another tactic of the woke generation is what is called catastrophism. So whatever issue you're fighting for at any one time, whether it be climate change, whether it be social injustice, whatever it is, your issue has to be portrayed in the media, has to be portrayed in the publicity you put out, in the protests that you make on the streets as a terrible abuse, a great wrong, and you utterly refuse to look at any other perspective on that, look at any other priorities that might conflict with it. You just become idealistic about your particular cause. And the classic case in Australia is the Greens political party, who are totally opposed to any gas or electricity emissions and want them shut down immediately. But of course, they still have them in their homes. They still fly to the Parliament in Canberra on jets. They still drive cars. But you see, they will not look at any priorities as to whether society can survive without the coal-fired plants and the gas that we currently have. They don't have to have any answers to these issues. They just say, we want it all closed down right now. Well, it's catastrophism. It's painting your cause as something, as an impending disaster. One of their major tactics is labelling. So anyone who doesn't fully support them can be labelled a racist, homophobic, which is, of course, if you have different views on sexuality, misogynist, you have different views to their views on the treatment of women, or you don't like trans, then you are transphobic. And they've got any number of labels they can put on you. And if you're in the public arena, or even in a job where you're being paid by the government in some way, having a label like that placed on you, whether it's true or not, or just or not, can be suicide for your career. And so people are terrified of having a label put on them. And that's a great weapon that they can use. Weaponizing. This is where they become very efficient at using social media. They go back through years and years of your posts in the past. They go back into your writings and your speeches and your alliances in past times of your life. And they find things that don't fit with your current profile, that don't fit with the woke agenda, and they can destroy you. And many people have been destroyed by having their past dragged up. They might have been perhaps in some university society. They might have had some views when they were very early in politics. And those views might have been the views of society. But now they have to make a grovelling apology and a sorry statement if they want to remain in public profile. So weaponizing is using social media against people to make them apologise and conform. One of the outcomes of woke is that it creates a very strong victim culture. They generate sympathy by complaining and blaming everyone else, especially governments, for their situations. All of the people who believe they have suffered a social injustice or some inherent injustice of their race, they blame everyone else for that rather than taking responsibility for themselves and saying, well, I'm thankful to live in a country that gives me the right of freedom of speech. I can contribute, I can improve this country by my efforts, rather than demanding to be helped up and demanding sympathy. And then we come to a very interesting tactic used by the wokes, and that is called intersectionalism. What the woke people tend to do is to drown opposition by putting a whole raft of different causes together into one particular statement. So anyone that's trying to make a statement on something or reason on one particular aspect is actually drowned out by the very volume of aspects that are thrown at them in these intersectional comments. I'm going to give you a great example of this. President Biden arranged a climate summit, and leaders from all around the world participated, including those of China and Russia, and they put up on the stage a 15-year-old Mexican activist, and she then began to berate the world leaders. And I want you to notice the intersectionality. In other words, the bundling of all the woke causes into one statement. And look at the words of a 15-year-old to world leaders. We demand, there's the anger, there's the demanding attitude. Comprehensive, non-Eurocentric, there's the attack on the West. And intersectional, there's the word that she's using. Climate education, including literacy on climate justice, there's the word justice. Environmental racism, there's racism. Ancestral and indigenous wisdom, there's the bringing in of ancestral wisdom. Disability justice, green careers, and sustainable living. And you're getting all the causes there put into one statement. And she demands that of the world leaders, and all of those things to be addressed in one particular sentence. That's intersectionality. That's the way that they silence opponents and confuse opponents by their putting together of all the demands into one basket. Catastrophism. This is making your cause seem that the world is about to end. This is a great book you might want to look up if you're interested, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. What it does is it unpicks some of the incredible things that have been put before us in the world's media, which are now proved to be totally false, claims and predictions which are totally false, and even recent ones like David Attenborough and others that have used false information to try and frighten the world on climate change. And we're not here to debate whether or not there is climate change. What we're saying is people overstate the case and they are dishonestly presenting the case. Here's an example of catastrophism in Australia with the Great Barrier Reef, which is one of the major assets. So it's on the World Heritage List. One of the great assets of Australia is the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef for centuries has gone through phases based on the climate around it. But of course, it's become a cause for the woke generation. And back in 2016, these are the news headlines around the world. The Great Barrier Reef is now terminal. It's in a terminal stage. They despair at the latest coral bleaching data. And the word terminal stage went right around the world based on reports that were written by people who were opposed to tourism and farming around the Great Barrier Reef. So the whole world started to believe that the Barrier Reef was going to die, it would never recover. Well, was that the case? Was this overstatement? Well, it certainly was. 2018, the same newspapers, the Great Barrier Reef showing signs of recovery. The reef definitely is not dead. Significant signs of recovery after a mass bleaching episode. Remarkable ability to recover from near death. And now the papers are saying, we got it all wrong. It's a rare admission that they got it wrong. But it certainly was a case of catastrophism going crazy. The Barrier Reef goes through phases where it has bleaching periods and then it recovers. It has all kinds of things that come through weather events and then it recovers. It's a great living organism and it's something which is beautiful to see. But again, here's an example how people are being led astray by false fake news. This is David Attenborough's classic. He put up a photograph and a film recently of walruses jumping off cliffs, and he said they were so hungry that they were jumping off and committing suicide. Well, that wasn't the case. They were actually being chased by polar bears, and some of them chose to try and jump down the cliffs to safety. But again, you can see how it's presented in the media, a catastrophic thing that wasn't actually true. You'll read in the climate change literature that there's a floating plastic island in the Pacific as big as Texas. Now, Texas is a mighty big place. There are islands of plastic floating around in parts of the world, and here's one of them, but it's nothing like the size of Texas, I can assure you. And again, this is something which is put in front of us with a pack of lies alongside of it. Yes, it's a very bad thing. Yes, it's something that needs cleaning up, but it's certainly not as big as they claim it to be. Another woke tactic is identity politics. This is a political approach where people of a particular gender, a religion, a race, a social background, a social class, or a sexual preference work out an angry agenda to promote their cause. So they have a way that they're going to fight their cause, and it's called identity politics. So everything then is strained through this particular identity you have chosen. And dealing with the one about sexual preference, and particularly trans, here's just some examples. The Canadian Parliament members were all threatened with shaming campaigns. There was a bill before the Canadian Parliament to stop people trying to deconvert people who wanted to go trans. And the members of the Canadian Parliament were threatened, all of them, with shaming campaigns. And surprisingly, they voted unanimously to accept the new trans law, even though many of them probably didn't agree with it because, hey, in Canada, a lot of people are strong Catholics. But when it came to Parliament and their careers on the line, the pressure was too much. President Biden, filling the Supreme Court vacancy, said, "I'm going to appoint a black woman." He didn't go for the best candidate necessarily. She might have been a good candidate, but you see, the identity politics was more important than getting the right person. President Biden also said in one of his speeches, transgender rights are the civil rights issue of our time. And while civil rights was a huge thing in America in the 1960s and 70s, now we're having trans put up, where in effect, trans has become a big issue like racism. But when you look at trans, it's only a very, very small minority of the population that claim to be in this category. It's not the big issue of our time, but it's being made so by the woke agenda, using it as a very good battle weapon to change the old ways. So here are some of the woke weapons. Insulting generalizations. White supremacist males is a very common term used by the proponents of this, particularly the women. Male patriarchy, mansplaining, is a term used by our Australian Prime Minister, a woman at the time. A new word she invented to say that doesn't matter what a man says, it's going to be wrong. It's going to be based on his prejudices against women. She called it mansplaining. So they have these generalizations. White conspiracy theories are everywhere in the woke social media world. In public service and academia and companies, they now have a thing called unconscious bias training that you have to go to. And what they do is they try and find out and to work out from the clever ways they do these things, who are the people that are conservative, and they try and change them and replace them with people who are called disruptors, people who will challenge the old ways, the old values, the old views. And it's not just about better business, it's about getting rid of people who have Christian values. So if you're asked to do unconscious bias training, be very, very cautious. It's aimed at people with conservative values. They're very quick to use government and media regulators to exclude and silence any contrary opinions. So, they go to all the different media boards and they get people's opinions removed who might just be stating the pure, obvious facts of the matter. And they use these regulations to get rid of you to saying it's hate speech and that it hurts people. They ignore reason and biology, particularly when it comes to trans. Free speech is stifled, rational debate is not allowed, and they attack the individual who will raise any matters against them. And they are very, very good at being personal in their attacks. They also create their own language to confuse the facts. And you'll be amazed when you start reading woke literature how much they use enormously big words, allusions you've never heard of, and dishonest arguments, and they love complexity. And I'm just going to show you now a paper that was put in front of the parliamentarians in the world about by a queer advocate called Judith Butler. And I'm going to start reading it, but you get an example here of the gobbledygook they use to actually confuse people. And this is the classic case of the emperor's new clothes. If you can't understand this or you can't see it, then you're not worthy for your office. And here's what she said. The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homogeneous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of the structure and marked a shift from a form of Althusserian theory that takes structural tonalities as theoretical objects to one in which the insights into the contingent possibilities of structure inaugurate a renewed conception of hegemony as bound up with the contingent sites and strategies of the articulation of power. And I defy you to tell me anything about what that actually means. But you see, you put that in front of a politician and they say, well, it sounds very convincing. And they're not prepared to try and contradict it and say that it's all rubbish. It's gobbledygook. And that's exactly what they are very good at. The attack on language. You know, only in the last week in Australia, the Australian Medicare system, which is our public health system, and all public hospitals now have taken away all of the old forms that used to record patient records. And all patient record forms have to exclude the word mother because it's deemed to be a female term. And somebody might be a male, but wants to be called, might be a female, but wants to be called a man. And you have to respect that. So you cannot call them a mother anymore. So in all the hospital language now, you have to use the term birthing parent. And that's because it may be that someone who identifies as a male now just had a baby. And if that's not the height of ridiculousness, I don't know what is. But this is the public health of Australia. We are now not allowed to use the word mother in our public health systems. And nursing staff have to now wear badges which have their name, and then underneath that, the gender terms they wish to be addressed with. So you might say, my name is Fred, I'm a she, and please address me as her. And that's how crazy it's got. So this is the madness. This is the attack on language. And of course, as they say, if you control the language, you control the culture. Even maths and science are now under attack from the woke world. Medicine, research and education have caved in. This is the Ontario Education Department. This is not some way out wacky religious school. This is the Education Department of Ontario. We are weeding out Eurocentric mathematical knowledges and replacing them with a decolonial, anti-racist approach to mathematics, including Indigenous pedagogical ways that include experiential learning. Again, notice they love big words. Indigenous pedagogical ways that include experiential learning. So we're going back to the people who had no written language very much, and to find out how they did mathematics. So they now decree that 2 and 2 is 5, or anything else you choose it to be, but it's not allowed to be 4. That is a colonial racist structure to say that 2 and 2 equals 4. And teaching 2 plus 4 is now unacceptable, as it's a hegemonic narrative. It's something which comes from the past, been imposed on us, and it's not true anymore that 2 and 2 equals 4. And my little comment in blue is, let's hope these students don't make any aeroplanes or bridges that I have to travel on. It's incredible. Back in 1949, George Orwell wrote a famous book called 1984, predicting the crazy world and the way it was going from his time would end up in a world where you had to believe that 2 and 2 is 5. And everybody laughed and thought, what a ridiculous prediction. But here we are. It's happened. New Zealand has just appointed language compliance officers by the government, and their job is to check all government documents, all the Labor MP speeches, press releases, publications and contracts, and they must use the new woke speak. And to make it more acceptable, they have said that public servants and MPs will refuse to communicate with anyone not using the accepted terminology. So if you were to write to them and say, I'm a mother, you may not get a reply. You've got to say, I'm a birth parent. And that's the way it has to be. And this is the New Zealand government actually imposing upon society not only woke speak, but also they have to now use Maori words as a salute to the original inhabitants of New Zealand. What the woke people never tell you is that there were people in New Zealand before the Maoris came from Polynesia or South America. And they don't tell you this, that they actually were all eaten by the Maoris. That's history you don't hear from the woke generation, but it's now being imposed upon people. And as they say, if you control the language, you control the argument, and therefore the concept of free speech is a farce. And that's where they are taking us with language compliance. Down the bottom is a little statement from a uni professor in New Zealand called Linda Smith. The term research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. The word itself is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous vocabulary. Now, I thought research was about establishing facts. People don't want facts anymore. They want us to acknowledge all the traditions and beliefs and the various beliefs of the original inhabitants of our countries. And some of those, of course, are quite fanciful. But research cannot be acceptable anymore. So this just shows you the craziness that we're now getting in the woke world in which we live. Just some of the madness of the left. You know, they talk a lot about tolerance. They always have. You've got to be tolerant of other people's views. There are many truths. But they'll then say, I'm only intolerant of one thing, and that's your intolerance of my views. And it's just like one of the great conundrums. Reason and rational facts no longer count. The radical left believes the collective good of the people can't be trusted anymore. They are an outrage industry. They will not debate on facts. It's all about conform or be cancelled. And the cancellations are mounting up. They got rid of Winston Churchill because of his colonial attitude. They got rid of Germaine Greer, which is amazing because she was one of the great forces at women's liberation, but she's also out. Geoffrey Blainey, the great Australian historian, is gone. Fred Hollows, the man who devoted his life and his foundation to giving sight back to people in third world countries, he's gone. Barry Humphries, the comedian, Richard Dawkins, the great atheist, he's gone. Benedict Cumberbatch, the actor, is gone. Rowan Atkinson's gone. And you could go on. J.K. Rowling's gone. They cancel people who they don't see as being of their particular type of thinking. So here are the battlegrounds. Racism and social justice is a great battleground, but they can be reverse racist to us. They can talk endlessly about supremacist white males and put us all in the same basket. And they can do that with impunity, but you cannot use any terms that are not woke. Historical issues such as slavery and colonial occupation are brought up all the time, and they ignore the benefits that came from it. You think of the health benefits, the education benefits, the housing benefits that have come from colonial empires being established and some of the better things of the West being brought to them. Equal rights for women are promoted at every level. The complete acceptance of LGBTQIA as the norm is being pushed everywhere. We have rainbow flags appearing on all of our public buildings now, on all government documents, alongside the First Nations flag as well as the national flag. Climate change, catastrophism, that is, you know, the climate change industry, the Extinction Rebellion people are out on the streets gluing themselves to the pavement and disrupting society. First Nation oppressions are being brought to light, and amazingly, things once not accepted by society are suddenly legal: gay marriage, sex changes in sport, etc. So the world is rapidly changing around us. And this is what it said in Revelation, a spirit of insanity working miracles. If you object to these new attitudes, then it becomes hate speech. So they can be as nasty as they like, as angry as they like, and aggressive as they like. They can go out and loot on the streets and smash things and burn things. And that's all part of them expressing their valid feelings of their values. But anyone who expresses a different attitude is not tolerated anymore. And this little comment is quite interesting. Every time hate speech is permitted, it costs someone part of his or herself. And there's the victim culture. Just to hear a reasoned, different point of view to my woke understanding, it takes away part of me. It hurts me. It destroys me. It takes away part of their self-respect or part of their sanity. It rips people to shreds and destroys society. That's catastrophism. This is the angry language of overstating the matter, which woke is so good at. This is a comment about this from a lady called Bianca Del Rio. People have gone down this spiral of cancel culture and the idea that everything is offensive. And people use terms like, well, with your views, I don't feel safe. We had a debate recently on the radio in Australia where a politician got up and said, well, if a certain member was elected to Parliament then she would not feel safe anymore, because somehow his views would make her feel unsafe and take away her sanity. And this is the victim culture, that anything you say that doesn't agree with me makes me feel unsafe. And they keep using these terms. I need to feel safe. This cartoon is very telling. Sorry, I don't have an opinion, just in case I get vilified on social media. And in Australia, we've had a number of sports stars and sport executives removed. Israel Folau was an all-Australian rugby player, had a very expensive contract. He was cancelled because he made statements about the views that God would have against some of the new sexual preferences. The Essendon Football Club, which is one of the biggest in Australia, appointed a new CEO. He was gone within one day on the job because he belonged to a Christian church. They did a lot of trolling on his background. They found that he belonged to a church which had godly values. And somebody in that church had made anti-gay statements, and he was removed from his job. The Premier of the state got involved in getting him removed the same day and thrown out because he belonged to a church that had godly values. So you can see they're coming after Christianity in a big way. This is the lady that won the job of being the CEO of the Girl Guides in Western Australia. When she sat at the desk and she read the Constitution, she found that before she took the job, they had agreed that any boy who chose to identify as a girl could sleep in the girls' tents on camps. So you could have a 16-year-old boy sleeping with 12-year-old girls in the girls' tent if he said, I think I'm a girl. She then put out to her executive board, can we revisit this? If we change it back to biological female, are we breaking the law? And she's just asking a question about this, which indicated her discomfort. Well, she was gone, sacked immediately, because she tweeted to her executive that we need to question this fact and the wisdom of putting 16-year-old boys in the tent with younger girls. Margaret Court, this lady has won the most Grand Slams of any woman in the history of tennis. I think something like 23 or 24. I think she's still even ahead of some of the men. She in Australia was greatly honoured for her sporting prowess, and they named the major arena in Australia, the Margaret Court Arena in Melbourne, where the Australian Open is held, after her. Then it was discovered that Margaret Court is the member of a church in Western Australia, and she made a statement which says the Bible does not support these new views on sexuality and sexual choice. That's all she said. Well, she has to be cancelled. And the Premier of Victoria, that's him there, Daniel Andrews, he wants that stadium renamed. He wants her completely banned from any events in Victoria. In fact, at the recent Australian Open, she was not allowed to be there. He will not even use her name anymore because he's so leftist and he hates anyone that has a Bible-based view on this matter. And Margaret Court was given an Australia Day honour. In other words, an independent panel of Australians decided that she should be honoured with an award in Australia's honour list. And, of course, Daniel Andrews spoke against it. One of our retiring, long-standing ABC journalists, Kerry O'Brien, also was given an honour the same time as Margaret Court. He refused to stand next to her and so refused his honours. And again, that was because he wanted to keep in with the woke generation. He wouldn't stand next to this great tennis player because she belonged to a church that said the Bible doesn't agree with the new views on sexuality. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? We live in a generation of emotionally weak people. Everything has to be watered down because it's offensive, including the truth. And I want you to have a good look at this particular little cartoon. You know, it's amazing how even the world can laugh at itself sometimes. Look at the game show title, Facts Don't Matter. And they have picked up exactly the great problem with the woke, and particularly when we come to trans. The facts are no longer relevant. It's about feelings. So in this game show, the host says, sorry, Arthur, your answer was actually correct, but Paul shouted his opinion louder. So there's the aggression. He gets the point. An extra bonus point goes to Sue as she was offended by your answer. And I think that's very, very, very lucid in explaining exactly how crazy our world has become. Facts don't matter. Anger does, and being offended does. So the next thing we're going to look at in our next session is the challenge of trans and the gay movement. I want to just quote to you the Bible, because the minute that we mention we're going to deal with these subjects, people immediately think we're homophobic or we've got some particular axe to grind against certain people. The truth of the matter is we are standing with the Bible. And the Apostle Paul, guided by God, said this: "Know ye not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived." And again, we have this common warning coming up: don't be deceived. "Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate," which of course is your trans, "nor abusers of themselves with mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, or extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God." And you couldn't get, and there are statement after statement along these lines in the New Testament. Even the words of the Lord Jesus Christ in Revelation 21 say exactly the same thing. People who do these things and practice these things cannot have a part of God's eternity. Now, God says if people repent of what they've done, if they align themselves with his values, he will forgive them. But he's not tolerant of evil. God says, "I change not. I've made my views clear. I made it clear in Sodom when I destroyed that place. I've made my views clear in Romans chapter 1 when Paul wrote. I make my views clear in these statements. I cannot tolerate these things, and I will not tolerate them, says God." So remember the mindset that kills. This is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17 from Weymouth's translation. "I implore you in the name of the Master, no longer to live as the Gentiles in the perverseness live, with the darkened understandings, having by reason of the ignorance which is deep-seated in them, and the insensibility of their moral nature, to share in the life of God, which God gives." People who think like the woke generation and deny the values of God have no part in the life of God's future. And so we leave that with you to think about as we move on to our third session, which will deal with particularly the trans movement and the religious impact. We need to have a battle. We have to stand up against these reasonings, these defiance of the knowledge of God, and bring all of our thoughts and all of our values in line with the scriptures of truth, because we do wrestle against spiritual wickedness in high places. Be not deceived. So let's leave that there, and we'll move on to the next one, which is to do with the trans movement.